First of all, I think we have to distinguish between the historian and an educator, because we're talking about the educational philosophy. The historian talks about the past. The educator has to give the past a meaning. What is the meaning of the event for my students 70 years later? And I will begin to say what, in my opinion, doesn't have a meaning. Big numbers don't have a meaning. Piles of bodies, which people used to show or like to show as the shock treatment, I think also doesn't have a meaning. What has a meaning is the fact that in the gas chamber, the Jewish world and all civilization lost people, communities, families. A whole spiritual world was lost in the Holocaust. And I think this is the connection that we have to do when we teach the Holocaust. So actually, because the Nazis dehumanized them and left us with piles of bodies, we have to actually rescue the individual out of the pile of bodies in order to speak about them. So the first principle that we have is we begin teaching the Holocaust from life before the Holocaust. If you want to know what we lost, let's get to know what existed. Who were the Jewish people before they became victims? I think it's a very important thing to teach about victims, all victims, not when they're victimized, but as people. I get to know them like I would get to know my relatives. Who were the Jews as living people in civilization? Most of the Jews in the eve of the Holocaust lived in the modern world, and as we say, the Holocaust happened in the modern world. That's why it's relevant. These people were living a very similar life like we live today in the modern world. Yes, they didn't have computers, but they were living in a world which many of the things that they were struggling and asking themselves are really questions that we are asking ourselves in the modern world. Therefore, I think we have to teach a lot about Jewish youngsters before the war. What did they dream about? How did they want to see the world? Which schools did they go? What did they do in their leisure time? And to get our students closer, to feel empathy to these people really before the Holocaust. And to teach about them in different countries that they were living, different things that they liked, different music, different sports, different things that engage our students to the world of these people before the Holocaust. I think there's something very important to teach about when we teach about giving a face and identity in the Holocaust. The Nazi didn't only kill the Jews. Before killing them, that they humanized them. What does it mean? They try to create a situation where people will lose the sense of what's to be human. And I'll give an example. When you are closed in a ghetto, like the biggest ghetto in Poland, in Warsaw, and you get 184 calories a day, the question is, how do you stay human? Okay, the Jews were imprisoned in that ghetto in a very crowded situation, and more than 80,000 of them died in the ghetto, not from gas chambers, but from dehumanization. So what happens to people when they're hungry, when they're dehumanized? How did people live in the world of chaos? I think that this is a question as a teacher, not how did 80,000 people die from starvation when they didn't get food. But the question is, if 500,000 people are imprisoned in that ghetto, so how do 400,000 people survive and live in the world of chaos? What happened to people? What happened to moral stands? What kind of moral dilemmas did these people have in their everyday life? Let's get to meet them in their everyday life. How did mothers cope with the fact that they couldn't give food to their children? What do they say about it, that their children had to smuggle food into the ghetto? Smuggling is actually stealing. But mothers write in their diaries, Yes, the child had to smuggle food into the ghetto, but we were trying to teach him not to steal something he doesn't need to overcome starvation. So they're trying to keep kind of morals in the world of chaos, although it's difficult. Another question could be, how did doctors function in the everyday life? What kind of moral dilemmas did doctors have in the everyday life? We're very familiar with a very famous dilemma that was presented in Ghetto Vilna by the head of the hospital when he gathers 5 people to a secret meeting in the ghetto, and he says, I have people sick with diabetes in my hospital. I managed to smuggle an amount of insulin that has to last for at least 3 months. But I know that if I'll offer all the people in the hospitals, the ones who are very sick and the ones who are less sick, the insulin that I have here, they will all die after a month. So what should I do, he asked the ethical committee. And in fact, in the ethical committee, there's a former Jewish lawyer, there's a rabbi, there's 2 of his colleagues, and 1 person from the Jewish leadership. And they get very furious at him. How do you ask us who to divide the medicine? We can't tell you who to give the medicine and who not to give. And he says, well, look, a month ago, I had a different sickness in my hospital. I offered the same medicine to all the sick people and they're all dead now. So I'm asking you to help me as an ethical committee who to save. The end of story was that the ethical committee refused to make a decision. Dr. Weinreb made the self-decision to offer a larger portion of insulin to the less sick people. But after 3 months, he didn't get a new supply, and like this or like that, everyone died. So 2 things we learned from this moral dilemma. A, and I want to be very clear because I think it's an educational principle. We teach moral dilemmas in the Holocaust for empathy, not for judgment. Teachers like to role play with dilemmas from the Holocaust. But I'm asking you very clearly and look in my eye, can you answer the question, what would you have done if you were Dr. Weinreb? Or can your students answer this question? They can't. So why do I present them that dilemma? I present them that dilemma because I want them to know that in the world of chaos, people ask moral questions. If you have a moral question, you still want to choose. If you have a moral question, you still have an eye. The Nazis didn't manage to destroy your ability to make choices. I'm going to make it difficult. You have to make choices in the world of choiceless choices, but you still want to make a choice. And the fact that you want to make a choice, and the fact that Dr. Weinreb gathered an ethical meeting, this is what I want my students to know about. And this moral dilemma teaches us another thing that I think is very important for teachers. And it's difficult for students, that whatever the Jews chose or didn't choose in the Holocaust, usually the end was death. Why is it difficult for students? It's difficult for students because I call it the elephant in the room when we teach Holocaust. Many people, students, teachers, are asking themselves, couldn't the Jews do more to survive? Why are they asking this question? You know why? They're asking these questions because we believe very strongly, and we tell it to students, if you'll do more effort, you'll succeed. We connect between success and the effort a person does in order to succeed. So they come and ask the questions, why didn't Jews do more effort to survive in the Holocaust? You told us that where there's a will, there's a way. You know, we have all these slogans here. That's why we have to explain to students that the Jews in the Holocaust were not killed because what they did, they were killed because who they were. The Nazis didn't care what the Jews did or didn't do in the Holocaust. I think nearly in every lesson we have to put something, when we teach moral dilemmas, also something about Nazi ideology to explain the frame and the context of where these dilemmas took place. Otherwise, you can ask all sorts of questions because you don't have the background and you don't have the knowledge about. And I think in the research also, it was said that without context, you can't go to stories and to moral dilemmas. And this is, I think, a very important thing. So if we began our educational philosophy and said we begin life before the war, and the second thing in our philosophy was how did they survive and live in the world of chaos, and can I learn some meaning for that for my students? The third thing in the philosophy will be the way the survivors chose to return for life. We think it's a very important thing to teach about. You see, so the historian says that the event is between 1933 and 1945. The educator asked questions before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. Two questions survivors asked themselves in the day of liberation: why to live? And the other question was the question of revenge. Why to live? Most of the survivors said very clearly, we want to live to find the world that we lost before the Holocaust. They were looking for family, they were looking for friends, they were looking for teachers, they were looking for the life that they lost. And I think the shock was, and the trauma was after the Holocaust, when they acknowledged that they were left alone in the world. No one was left. And this also deepened the question of revenge. And here we have something very unique that I think is important for our teaching. The new meaning survivors gave for the word revenge. When survivors talked about revenge in a DP camp, they talked about continuation and building families. Survivors got married, survivors brought children to the world, not 20 years after the Holocaust, but from 1946 to 1948, 2,500 babies were born in the displaced camp Bergen-Belsen. As a teacher, it astonishes me the educational programs that were built for children in the DP camps after the war. They were trying to mend the world. They said if the world was destroyed, survivors believed not in revenge, what we say eye against eye, but in building. This doesn't mean that all the survivors lived happily ever after. I want to be very clear here. There were survivors that couldn't return back to normal life. Many survivors that returned to normal life had nightmares, and we know it from the Israeli society because many of our parents used to get up in the middle of the night and go back to the trauma that they went through the Holocaust. So it's not happily ever after, but I think it has a great educational meaning for our students to understand that many people asked after the Holocaust if the Holocaust was done in the model world by learned people, maybe all the values of the modern world shouldn't exist anymore. I think the survivors gave the answer that if you destroy the world, you can also mend it, and there's a future for the world. So thank you.